So I will put plugin in the direct now with the Zoom. If ever you want to put the YouTube on in your home, don't forget to cut off the sound if you're on Zoom. So, hello, my name is Valerian, and I'm part of the Brahma Kumari World Spiritual University, representing them at the UN. And this is actually one of the founding organizations of the Geneva Interfaith Forum for Climate Change, Environment, and Human Rights. The organization who is responsible to organize these different webinars. It's a series of 3. While the COVID-19 crisis is affecting the whole of humanity in various ways, posing a far-reaching threat in human rights, it brings to light our responsibility to ensure we do not return to behaviors that leave the vast majority of human family behind. And as the major multilateral negotiations on climate change, the COP26, who is scheduled for 2020, has been postponed, and also the Human Rights Council 44th session, which was due in June, who's happening now, is taking place in a very restricted manner. It is crucial that the plans for recovery from COVID-19 uphold the human rights, health, and well-being of citizens, and do not delay urging climate action. Against this background, the Geneva Interfaith Forum has organized a series of informed discussions on climate change and human rights from an ethical and spiritual perspective, bringing together a diverse variety of voices. Because at the UN in Geneva, many physical events won't be able to happen. We thought about organizing these different events, such as this particular webinar. So the aim is to inform and share the real life perspective on human rights and climate change, to engage grassroots partners and the general public, and to propose an ethical and spiritual perspective and bring a diverse variety of voices. So we do not have much time. We only have an hour. And the first person that is going to speak to us is Yves Lador. He's a colleague from Geneva, and he works as a consultant, and one of his main assignments is to represent the environmental public interest of the legal organization Earth Justice at the UN in Geneva. So hello, Yves, could you please describe to us the current situation regarding climate change and human rights, as well as share with us the different UN dynamics who are operating at the moment. Please, Yves, the floor is yours.
Well, hello, Valerian, and thank you very much for this invitation. Thank you for organizing this event, because it is quite a special time indeed, and the work at the UN Human Rights Council right now is not really possible as we used to do it. So thanks a lot to having me in this discussion and for organizing such a debate. Well, it's quite a challenging and wide question that you're asking me, Valerian. So if you allow, I'll try just to focus on 3 main points. And the very first one is, first, the negative impact on human rights about climate change. Because one of the questions is also, why should we look at climate change issues through the lens of human rights? I mean, it's already quite a complicated issue, and that's what we are hearing a lot is, this is just a secondary question. Well, it's not. And the reason for that is that In the impact, I have 3 types of impacts, which are pretty big. The first one is the direct impact everybody can think about. Right now, as we are in a health crisis, we know that, and we're pretty aware about these health issues. We know that there is a health issue relating to to climate change. For example, the heat waves have a very strong impact, and even stronger in urban areas. It has an impact on drought, for example, and which in turn has an impact on the right to food and so on, or right to access to water and so on. There's also an issue, for example, on the rights of the right to housing, in the sense that many people will have to relocate in a way or another. And actually, one of the problems we have today, which seems to be an increasing unseen problem, is that you have forced non-migration or forced immobilization, which is becoming quite an issue because some people will need to move and they don't have the capacity to move because the environment where they are will not sustain their life anymore. So these are the type of problems. And of course, related to that, we have all the issues of movement of people, migration, human mobility. These are just to mention a few, and only a few, the direct impacts. But then you have indirect impacts. The very first one, which is quite a worry, is the climate measures or the measures to combat climate in itself. And that's one of the challenges in the discussion in the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, because it is not considering human rights the way it should. And then if you just want to only focus on reducing CO2 emissions, and that's it, then you can do it by a lot of means, which will make the situation worse. And that's what we're seeing in a number of in projects. So you have an indirect effect on human rights, and actually even on the impact of climate change itself, because you're aggravating the situation. Another issue, for example, also in indirect rights, is the right to self-determination. If states are losing their physical structure, the physical basis on which they are, then how can people self-govern? Where will they stay, and so on? These are real, very fundamental questions, which are very far from having an answer right now. And if we don't deal with them, then it means more and more human rights violation will come from this. And then you have also the increase of vulnerability, because a lot of the problems that we already have now within our societies are aggravated or increased by the climate change. The impact of women, and we're going to be talking about that just later, but you can think of the rights of indigenous people who see their territories being already very often hit by industrializations, and now the ecosystems on which they are used to live are being changed by the climate change. So again, here the livelihoods, their culture, and everything like that. We can think of children, we can think of elderly people. So we see a lot of already existing marginalization being increased by climate change. So the second point is that what human rights brings is not just only making a long list of victims. It's very first a reality check. If you look at how the human rights are preserved in the way you do your climate change policies, then it gives you a reality check. Are you really working on reducing the impact of climate change or not? And that's quite a challenge. And of course, when you have this look, and actually you don't have such a look in the UNFCCC, and there's no other place except within the human rights bodies that we can try to have such a vision and to see the scope and the urgency of the issue. And also another issue, which of course related to accountability, but also to the capacity to act. When we insist on the fact that people do have rights in the framework of climate change, it's also to make sure that they are in a situation where they can act upon this. And I think here we definitely have a link to do with what's happening today with the COVID crisis, because we have seen how in many situations decisions are taken regardless of the situation, where the people are, how they can cope with it, and how they can act on this issue. So this is a very worrying sign, where we see that if you don't respect human rights, then you're weakening your capacity to react, your capacity to have resilience. And then again, without human rights, you make the whole situation worse. So just briefly to finish on what are the dynamics in the human rights system. I think for us,
I think maybe we could have this part a bit later. We're talking about the questions. because we do have a time to go on conversing. So thank you very much. I was very touched by your last point on the capacity to act. Capacity to act when people are faced with the crisis of climate change, or with the COVID, or with any other crisis, as a matter of fact, that's touching the human rights in their situation. So I think this is at the center of our conversation today, so I'm sure we'll come back to it later. Thanks so much for bringing this in.
Thank you to you.
Thanks. So could you please also put your phones in silence? That might help a lot in terms of interferences. So I didn't introduce all our panelists before, but I might do so now. Our next panelist is Tetet, and she is working in the feminist issues regarding climate change. And she's been advocating for climate justice for more than a decade now. She was previously a member of the Philippine delegation to climate talks, but she really likes to work in communities. And then after that, we'll have Hindu Maru, who is representing the Indigenous. I could say she's like the face of the Indigenous perspective in the climate change conversation. She's been an amazing actor in bringing things to life for people in everything to do with the Indigenous rights. And then we will have Yip, who is Yip Sanyal. He sometimes calls himself a recovering climate negotiator. And he is a person who made for many the topic of climate change famous in a way, because he decided to go on a hunger strike when the typhoon that happened at that time in his country hit Philippines so badly that his whole family was in danger, and he wanted to make sure that things would move forward. He's also a Greta fan, and he's this ex-director of Greenpeace for Asia, South Asia. And then we will have Sister Genti, who is the Brahma Kumari World Spiritual University representative. And she's someone who's done extensive research on the role of values in this changing world. So without further ado, I really want to give the word now, but I just wanted you all to have a perspective on our panel, to have Tetet tell us about how women's rights are impacted today by the climate change situation. Tetet, the world is yours. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm so honored to be in this panel today, this afternoon, tonight, depending on which time zone you are in. At the onset, let me state that feminist movements say that the struggle for climate justice will not be won without gender justice, and vice versa. The struggle for gender justice will not be won without climate justice. So as advocates, we recognize the root causes of the climate crisis, that as we take from the earth to produce and consume, we also take resources, lands, and rights from others to enable this process. The changing climate resulting from this exploitative process further increases disparities as its impacts hit already vulnerable populations. Those who have done the least to contribute to this crisis hit hardest. While climate change affects everyone, women and men experience the impacts differently. And there is so much evidence that women in all their diversities are disproportionately negatively affected. For instance, now we have information, we have data everywhere that says women and girls make up 6 out of 10 of the poorest people worldwide. Over 50% of the 1.5 billion people living on less than $1 a day are women. Women and children spend 8 hours or more each day collecting water. Women own just 2% of the world's land resources. Two-thirds of the 774 million illiterate adults worldwide are women. Women earn less than men for work of equal value. Women bear the brunt of unpaid care work. So there's already a lot of evidence to show that there are a lot of inequalities happening on top of each other, and the climate crisis exacerbates and magnifies all of these injustices that women face all over the world. So women in all their diversities often have limited access to resources, they have more restrictive rights, limited mobility, and a muted voice in shaping decisions and influencing policy. Now, although advances have been made on gender equality initiatives globally, many disparities remain, both in developed and developing countries, because of ingrained government policies, economic constraints, and social norms. And I would like to stress the last point, no? Social norms which make women particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. For instance, during storms and disasters, it's been found out that more women than men lose their lives, not due to physical differences, but due to social and traditional constructs that limit women's ability to protect themselves. For instance, restrictive clothing that hinder women's mobility to move fast and move quickly. Women's assigned roles as caregivers in the family, or this cultural practice that women cannot move without the company of a male relative, and many others. These are structures that limit women's ability to own land, borrow and invest money, or even start a business, which is very, very important given the context of COVID today. How can you support women's empowerment if there are very deeply ingrained cultural and social norms that hinder women's mobility, especially in the face of a pandemic? Now, you will say there are many laws already to support advancing gender equality and women's rights. Now, there are so many in the UN, including the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, or the CEDAW. The Universal Declaration on Human Rights is there. The Beijing Platform of Action is there. So there are a lot of laws that address issues of resources, credit, education, the right to work, all of which impact on women's capacity to adapt to climate change and participate in planning and implementation to address climate change. However, women's human rights, it must be remembered, are part of and central to climate justice. And as feminists, we engage in a global intersectional feminist advocacy. So as feminists always say, we will not give up on our beautiful planet. And we will raise our voices, strengthen our movements to claim our right to live in a healthy environment. Now, so the many intersections all point to the lack of justice. Whether it's migrant justice, racial justice, economic justice, labor justice, gender and indigenous peoples justice. These are all the result of exploitative. Yes?
I think that we will keep, if you have just one sentence to finish, so we can keep the rest of your input for the conversation afterwards.
All right. So I think the bottom line here is we cannot dichotomize the struggle. The struggle for women's equality, gender equality, is part and parcel of the struggle for climate justice. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tet, and I look forward to more in our conversation next. So this is just to remind all of you that if you are having questions or want particularly topics to be talked about, we do have the possibility of using an email that has been provided to you, or also the YouTube chat that is there whilst you're watching this seminar. And someone is monitoring the questions and will then summarize them to our panelists. Fetet, I was very touched by what you said. Thank you so much to bringing this whole aspect of gender with so much clarity. And particularly, I was very moved by what you said about how women are strong and they could come out of danger, but how there is restriction because of the cultural aspect and because of the different ways that women have to keep to certain norms in all the different places around the world. So I think this is an amazing point that you're bringing. So without delaying further, I would really like to give the word now to our dear friend Hindu. Hindu is an environmental activist and she's also a geographer. And she is also a poor woman from Chad. And she's the coordinator of the autochthonous people of Chad and serves as the co-director of the Pavilion of the World Indigenous Peoples Initiative. And so really, I think for many of us, she's representing the voice of those who have no voice. And she has been advocating also for bringing the culture, the indigenous culture, with all the solutions it promotes to the table at the COP. So please, Hindu, the floor is yours. And you will, of course, give us the indigenous perspective on everything that's happening at the moment, the COVID, the human rights perspective on climate change. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much, Veronique. Good morning, good afternoon of everybody. And I hope that you all are doing well and your family also in this very critical time. But I will start by saying Jamwali to all of you. I will start by the last sentence of my sister Tetet, who say, we will never give up to protect our planet. So let me remind you that indigenous peoples are 5% of the world populations, and we protect 80% of the world biodiversity. That means we depend of all those different ecosystems around the world, and that's why we are protecting. And that also keep us in a very vulnerable place vis-a-vis to the climate change impact. And I'm very scared and worried now about the COVID crisis also, who's adding in the climate crisis that we are living. Indigenous communities around all the world are depending from forests, mountains, savanna, glaciers. We have something in common. Is the dependence of our land resources together. And that's also dependence of it, who learn us 100,000 of years of living in harmony with this ecosystem. But we are seeing with these industrializations, our land territories and resources are the most impacted. I give you just the example of my community where I come from in Chad. So we are living as nomadic and semi-nomadic around the Lake Chad. And Lake Chad, who used to be 25,000 kilometers squares of the fresh water, just in my lifetime, 90% of this water evaporated, just disappeared. So we have about 2,000 kilometers square only. And you have like more than 40 million people living and depending from these resources. And at the end of the day is the conflict between the communities fighting to get access to these resources. So for me, this is a human rights issues, because if someone cannot access to the food, to the water to drink, and to the land, they have to fight every day. So it's the human right violation. So they are always in the basic need. They do not talk about having right to the education, right to the health, or whatever development that they can get access. Because the resources that depend on it are already vulnerable and shrinking, and then creating conflict rather than people's living in harmony among them. And it is the same for my brothers and sisters in the forest, where you can have Amazon or Indonesia or Congo Basin. So the community is seeing the resources that shrinking. Forests are burning or cut it by the industrializations, and they are seeing them home are taken away from them. And for us, if the nature is destroyed, it is not only like the environment and economy and does it. It is our culture, it is our identity, it is our spiritual place where we depend on it. And that's why the climate impact is changing all what we are, what we have, and who we are. So that's also why we are fighting to get this right to be restored back. And now with the COVID crisis, they have something in common because climate is hitting the most vulnerables and COVID is hitting the most vulnerables. We are seeing the indigenous communities, like in my communities where there is no access to clean water to drink, how the peoples can wash them hand even every 4 hours. It's completely impossible and unimaginable. So they cannot get access to the soap, they cannot get access to the clean water, they cannot protect themselves. And communities who do not have access to the basic health rights, they cannot get access if they have one person who is contact the COVID, what they can do. And our social life is completely also different than what the measures of the COVID are sitting down. Like you have to put like 1 hour, 1 meter among the peoples. You cannot eat in the same casserole or drink or whatever. No, our culture do not allow us to do that. We have to eat together. We do not have enough space to be together. We have to be all in the one place. So that's make us in a very vulnerable place. And suddenly in this last point, we can really learn from the COVID action because we are seeing all the international communities that coming together. They're putting billions and billions of money to inject into the economy. So what we can ask them to use this for the right, to do not inject this money in the fossil fuel, to do not inject it in the big industry, but to use it for a sustainable development issues, to use it for the community's needs, to reinforce the infrastructures that health, educations, access to the market, to invest it in a renewable energy where the communities can get access and then can benefit from it, to invest this money for the sustainability of the all. And we show the world that we can do it. If all the countries come together, all the neighborhood know the name now of the neighbors. So that will be a good lesson to adapt and apply to the climate change. And that's what indigenous peoples know through the traditional knowledge, through the wisdom that we have with the environment. So let us do it and we can make it together. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Hindu, for bringing this perspective to us. And, you know, it's an amazing thing that 5% of the population has been protecting more than 80% of the resources. And these resources are shrinking. And you are now reminding us that we need a renewable kind of world who will look at sustainability for all. So thank you so much, Hindu, for that. Our next friend on the panel is Yip Sanyal. As I was saying earlier, he is a very well-known peace activist. He's a spiritual ambassador. He's been doing pilgrimages. He's been working for Greenpeace. So really, I don't think he needs much of an introduction. We're very happy that you have accepted our invitation, Yip, and we would really like you to give us the perspective of the global South and the dangers and threats that climate change poses to human rights in this perspective. Thank you. Go ahead, the floor is yours, Yip.
Thank you very much, Valerian, and I hope you're hearing me all right. It is such an honor for me to be part of this panel with all of the wonderful friends we have here, and pleasant greetings to everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, and a blessed day to all of you. We see a lot of confusion around us, really, and that is, there's a lot of good reason for that. We now live in a world that has become drastically different from the world we saw at the start of 2020. Well, even very different from maybe 3 months ago. But we do live in the same world where the climate crisis persists, and it has not gone away at all. And living in the same world order that has betrayed us time and again, including bringing us into an era of a climate emergency, and also now this global health emergency. It's not always easy to just link climate change and human rights to our current context of the COVID-19 pandemic. But this disruption we're all experiencing right now is leading our societies, which we believe is now more connected than ever. Now we're all seeing each other on the screen more often, and leading our societies to challenge our present and think about our future differently. And so we must put all of our weight as a community, regardless of where we all come from, in trying to make this disruption work for changing society as we have known it. A society, and I'm saying this is the same societies that has caused the climate crisis, individualistic, unequal, destroying nature, profit-driven, towards one that we truly need, not just to address this public, this health emergency, but to conquer the climate emergency. Societies that are open, egalitarian, peaceful, in harmony with each other and with nature, and with the public good as a driving force. I think that that's a bit far from now, but the moments where things can pivot really are often difficult to see when we are in them. Well, the comparison with the COVID crisis is new. Climate injustice is an age-old story. My country and many communities in the global south have been the victim of someone else's greed and recklessness for too long. And our history is a history of people conquered. Our narrative is despite colonization, war, tyranny, and poverty. And we have heard too many stories from those who have lost children, parents, brothers, sisters, friends, and many other loved ones, to even more fiercer typhoons or tropical cyclones, or to hunger and famine because of droughts and collapse of food systems, the shadows of which continue to steal our peace of mind long after our loved ones have been laid to rest. And it prompts us to ask, is this the kind of life our children will face? And we all know for many, many years now that the climate crisis is the greatest threat many communities, many countries have ever faced. And in particular, many communities in the global south. It is an existential risk for many of us, especially low-lying islands, those that are dependent on a healthy environment. And it is a humanitarian challenge that impedes our aspiration to develop sustainably, both for our current generation and for future ones. And so for our part of the world, it has been stressed many, many times that in particular, even Southeast Asia and the Philippines will be one of the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And what we want is truly to feel safe, to have enough to eat, to have access to health care when we are sick, to have a home to lay our heads down every night, to have work, to get an education, to send our children to school so they may enjoy better lives, to pass our culture down to the next generation, and to realize the dreams that we have: freedom from fear, freedom from want, life with dignity. These are basic human rights, so basic that we cannot help but question why they seem to be such elusive, far-fetched dream to many people and communities living under the specter of the climate crisis. And therefore, we recognize that we need to do more to increase our efforts to place human rights at the core of the climate conversation. And we'll do so by following the lead of indigenous peoples, youth, women, people living in poverty, and many, many other communities that are marginalized and who are leading the call for climate justice and against all that destroy our only home. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Yip, for bringing the whole aspect of the intergenerational need to pass on a word that's healthy to the next generation, but also to remind us that we need to be free from fear in order to pass on also this right to live in a world that's going to allow people to be free from fear. And I think this is an IQ for Sister Genty, who, as I said, has been studying for many years. She's the representative of the Brahma Kumari World Spiritual University for Geneva, but she's also the director of this university for Europe and Middle East. And she will share with us about the spiritual consciousness that is needed in order to work together better, because the world is one, the poor and the rich are one human family, and deal with the critical human rights and environmental rights situation. So please, Sister Genty, the floor is yours. I think you need to unmute your mic, Sister Genty, for us to hear you.
Yeah, thank you. A greeting of peace, Om Shanti. So firstly, thank you, Valerian, for putting this together. And many thanks to each one of the panelists who have shared a very specific perspective that's been very, very important. From a spiritual perspective, I see that perhaps COVID has pushed us to the point where we realize that we're actually part of one world family, and the world is one planet and is our home for all. Because what happens is that something starts in China and today it's landed up in Brazil within the space of some weeks. But of course, all the countries between China and Brazil have also had an impact. I read the story of two women who had to travel to New Zealand, where New Zealand had stated that they were virus-free, and now the two women came on a mercy mission for a relative, a parent who was dying, and they actually didn't manage to make it to see the parent, but they brought with themselves the positive virus, and now they've discovered that 320 people have been in touch with them. So we see how the virus knows no boundaries, but surely our love, our humaneness, our humanity also knows no boundaries at all. And when we come to a spiritual awareness and we see each other as that inner being, the being which is not dependent on my position, my possessions, my house, my gender, even the country in which I was born, the religion I was born into, if I can go beyond all of those things and come back to the inner identity of the self, the being that I truly am, I begin to see the same in all. I connect with the human family in a very beautiful way. And then, of course, I want to be able to cooperate with my human family rather than enter conflict or competition with them. Just imagine we are in the same boat and we can't say that the water is leaking only in one part of the boat. It's our boat. And so it's not their side of the boat, it's our boat, and the water is not just leaking, it's running in with a huge, huge velocity. And so I think that perhaps the spiritual consciousness of one family and one home can help us to move together into the spirit of cooperation. And with that cooperation, yes, then definitely as one people, we can find ways to overcome the situation. I also see very much the whole subject of justice as being not just a legalistic factor or not just a factor to pay homage to in words, but if you think about human rights, it is a factor of justice, but it's very much a human factor. Surely all human beings have the same right to everything that the world offers. it cannot be possible that 20% of the world's population claim access to 80% of the world's resources, which has been the history of humanity for now too long. I think that maybe now is a time when we're seeing riots and protests across the world, not just for climate change at the moment. We've seen those also last year, but this year it's been really for the rights of human beings. And so we've been faced with a situation where it's absolutely highlighted that a huge part of the world is deprived of those rights. Now, spirituality means that I tap into the compassion and the love through which I can do something to restore dignity to each and every human being. I think that sometimes we feel a little bit hopeless. What can one individual do, or what can one community do, or what can one group of people do? But I think the world together today is recognizing so much that we've ignored in the past. And so I feel that the time is right to actually push forward this awareness of spirituality in one family and being able to care and share with all. There's an iconic image that I want to leave you with, and that was of an actor in London who picked up an anti-protester. The actor was in a black skin, but the protester was in the white skin. And he picked up the anti-protester, and because he was lying on the floor, he'd been hit hard, and he carried him to the police and said, "Now, please look after him." And I think that picture has gone around the globe. And why I talk about it is because the original state of the human spirit is of compassion. And I think that now it's time for compassion in a very deep way for the self and for my human family. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sister Genti, for reminding us of our togetherness. We are really one family, and for reminding us about the sense of the inner core and how people will get empowered when they are remembering their inner power. So what I would like you to tell us maybe now, all of you, it's a question for all of you, is what political conditions do we need to fulfill now to have a fair world tomorrow? Like looking forward, what's the most urgent thing to do? And maybe I have also different questions for more of you, and if there is any more, I will let you know. So maybe you can all take this question and answer it in different, according to your different perspectives. Thank you. Who would like to talk first?
Hi, maybe I will go first, just to tell you that Eve said he do not have the sound, if someone can fix it. So for your questions, who will take the political power? I think there is already tools. We have the UN Convention on Climate Change, who is there. And for the part of Indigenous peoples, we can say thanks to the Paris Agreement, since that we do have the recognition of human rights, Indigenous people rights, genders, youth, health, and we do have another one who is the local communities and Indigenous people platform, who established now in the facilitative working group. So politically at the international level, if they want to act for the climate change and for Indigenous peoples particular, so they can really implement in the local level or the national level and subnational level, the platform. The platform is saying that they cannot just to come with the solution who do not respect the rights of indigenous peoples. And for us, respecting the rights of indigenous people is respecting our land, our territories, our resources. And that's also to tell them that we do have the free, prior, and informed consent. We can decide for our land if it is good for us or not. And secondly, it's to recognize the wisdom of the knowledge that we do have. We have centuries of the knowledge, and that have been recognized by the IPCC report, who is the expert group, intergovernmental expert group within the convention that combating desertifications. So in these conventions, they already recognize indigenous people's knowledge are very important to protect the land, territories, and resources. So the issue is how they can include this knowledge and right into the national adaptation plan, national mitigation plan, if they wanted to design the climate change. So they have to go through those knowledges to respect our rights. And then lastly, it's on the COVID actions. The world showed the leadership on the COVID, but it's also marginalized the other peoples. So how that can respect better and include the indigenous peoples? The response cannot be only for the peoples in the town, but they can be decentralized, and then they can be included onto the decision making. So with this one, I think we can have a right political response both to the COVID and to the climate change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hindu, for bringing these aspects on the focus of our attention. So, any other comment on what kind of action do we need to do now? I think I hear Tetet's dog. Maybe it means she wants to speak.
Yes, I think the dog is perfectly aligned with what I want to say right now. Just last week, there was another UN meeting to show that the UNFCCC has not taken a pandemic break. You know, many of the leaders in the climate negotiations convened a 10-day meeting to show the world that the work must go on in terms of addressing the climate crisis. But then here I want to be controversial. We're already on our way to the 26th meeting of the Conference of Parties, and yet what we see in our midst is that the pledges, they're not even hard commitments. No, these are pledges that were drawn up by countries, are not enough to keep us from burning. So what I'm saying is the climate negotiations, the way things are going right now, it's going to put the world in a trajectory of burning. It's warming, and it's going to burn everyone. Now, everyone is also saying we can't go back to normal because normal was the problem in the first place. Normal was what got us into this mess in the first place. So when we try to look for solutions, you know, the political leadership is supposedly there with the UN, with multilateralism. But I think now is the moment where the UN, in its 75th year foundation, it really needs to have a thorough look back, you know, because right now I think the UN multilateralism per se is facing a huge crisis of legitimacy and relevance, because more and more people are losing their faith, you know, that governments can actually solve the climate crisis, because there's total lack of accountability, total lack of ambition. What we see are market solutions, what we see are false solutions. So I think now is the moment now when people would have to really assert and demand accountability through their movements, through their organizations. You know, we need to raise our voices that real change can happen with the movements and with the people.
With the people. Thank you so much, Tetet, for this. So who would like to speak next? It's the last chance. Maybe Sister Genti? Okay, go ahead.
Yes, I just want to reiterate what's just been said, because I think now people have been given a voice. Until now, although we might have had democracy in many countries and so forth, but the voice of the people is now being heard. Somebody commented that riots are an indication of the voice of those who haven't been heard. And so I think that now that voices are being raised in such a strong way, I'm sure that those in leadership and powers will listen to those voices, and that might bring about change. And I'm not talking about violent riots, but I'm talking about raising our voices together so that then we make an impact and those in authority understand that things have to change. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sister Genti, for bringing the importance of the voice of the people with your own words in this way. I think Eve wanted to follow up on this. Please, Eve.
Yes, well, thank you. I just wanted to follow up on the two last intervention, because I do agree about, I mean, we can all see the problem we have with the multilateral systems and the crisis it's getting on. And I think it's even worse. It's not only just a question of legitimacy or relevance, it's also right now a power struggle. And multilateralism is more on dealing with the power struggle than really trying to solve the problems. We do have a lever in our hands, which can be used by the movements. And I'm thinking here about the national determined contributions. Now, I know that sounds pretty technical, but it's exactly the pledges you were talking about, Tetet. And it's very important because they have to be fixed at the national level, which means indeed the movements can precisely ask for, request much more ambition at each level. And of course, the higher you can get ambitions in your own country, the higher you can afterwards push on the others so that they also get a real strong ambition. And this is a regular process, but normally when we all meet again in Glasgow for the COP26, we're supposed to see what has been achieved. And I think we should use the time frame we have until then as movements to request much more on the ambition. And now there's other means. And I'm thinking, for example, of the Universal Periodic Review, where countries are coming for their own human rights review. In here, we have to introduce the climate change issues, which is not done enough. So in a way, governments must hear the requests and what we're asking for again and again. And we can see other avenues where we can do a very coherent and I would say also collective work. What is interesting, and I can just finish on that, is in the preamble of the Paris Agreement, you have very strong human rights elements. We wanted it into the operative part. That's the part we've lost. But what we didn't lose is getting a very clear and the strongest reference to human rights in any environmental treaty up to date. So this was possible only because we had an alliance of all the movements who are right now in this panel, women groups, indigenous peoples. We had a common and global strategy. And I think we need to do the same today on the question of the NDCs in the perspective of the COP26, where we will be able to put our governments to account, governments and companies to account.
Thank you so much for bringing the NDCs at the center of the table where they belong, because this is the engagement that countries do have to take for the world tomorrow. Yep, I think you wanted to follow up on this.
Yes.
We do have many positive comments on the YouTube. People who are very interested, who appreciate what all of you have been saying. There's no direct questions, but a lot of appreciation. And yes, we will keep this webinar online. I hope we can keep the same link for it. So yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you, Valerian. And now that NDCs are, as you said, on the table, I think it's really important for us. And we're having this conversation because we believe we have been given a wake-up call. It's sort of a reckoning. I would always say to friends that the COVID-19 is not a war with a virus. We're still at war with ourselves. And you know, it can go either way right now. We don't know what extent the impact will be on every country until this is until we've overcome this whole crisis. But we might be in a situation where it is a perfect condition for many governments and the elites to implement political and economic agenda that will deepen the inequalities we already have and undercut everyone else. It is a dangerous time, but we can ensure that doesn't happen. I mean, we've never been given a wake-up call as much as this, and It's funny when we talk about both international and national actions, ambition to solve the climate crisis. It's the same things that you need for us to win this. Again, it's not a war with COVID, a war against ourselves, where we see so much more suffering and inequality being exposed because of the way governments are responding to coronavirus. So your question is what political momentum we must preserve. I think we should not let up. I think this is a moment for us to highlight all of those issues, and the entire societies must come together. Every nation must step up. Collaboration must happen across all sectors. But left on their own, we all know that the same with coronavirus and the climate crisis. Even the best national level actions will not match the global scale and complexity of the crisis. And this test demands more than ever a concerted, highly coordinated, most fastidious, most out-of-the-box action from the world's richest economies and maximum support to the poorest and most vulnerable. You see, it's both the same for the climate crisis and the coronavirus crisis.
Thank you so much for bringing this voice to us. I think we are at war with ourselves, and this goes into what Sister Genty has been saying about the inner dignity. I think the ambition is dangerous, and I think this is echoing it when Hindu has been saying how we really need to respect our planet and our brothers and sisters. So yes, it is a wake-up call. It is an opportunity for all of us to come together. I fully agree with that. So to all the people who have been with us, yes, we will keep that same YouTube link for you to share or watch again. We will not deactivate it. It will still be there. I wanted to share with you also on my screen the fact that we will also have the next different webinars that will happen very soon. So this is what I would like you to know. We will have them on the 24th, and we will also have another one on the 1st of July. So I'm just sharing my screen with you now for if you're a visual person, that might help you. We have many other very interesting friends that will be with us for these two next webinars. I would like to indicate that because we are very interested in the Global South, we thought we should have different languages. So the webinar of the 1st of July will be in Spanish. But because we also wanted to share a spiritual perspective, we would like to ask Sister Genty to lead us to finish this conference into a 1-minute moment of contemplation or meditation to finish on a peaceful, open way. Please, Sister Genty.
Thank you. I go on an inner journey, and I leave outside fear, anxiety, and worry. And going inwards, I tap into the dignity of the inner being, the vision of hope that I hold for the future, but also the truth and beauty and goodness of the inner being. And being in touch with myself in this way, I see all others with that vision of respect and dignity. All of us in harmony with the self, with each other, but also harmony with all forms of life and harmony with nature itself. Thank you.
Thank
Om
you.
Shanti.
Om Shanti. Thank you so much to each one of you, Yip Sanyal, Tetet, Eve, Sister Genti, and Hindu, who's just left us because she has another panel. So you're welcome to our next panel on the 24th. And I hope that this webinar was instructive and interesting for all of you. Goodbye.